The wagon had already gone when she reached the end of the road. She stood at the edge of what the man at the supply depot had called a town, though the word seemed generous. There were 8 buildings she could count, and 3 of them were still open to the sky. A dog watched her from beneath a porch, with the particular stillness of an animal that had learned to conserve everything. She watched it back. Then she picked up her bag and walked toward the building with the most smoke coming from its chimney. The woman inside, a broad-shouldered woman with flour on her apron and the expression of someone who had heard every possible story, looked at her the way people look at weather they have not planned for. "I'm looking for work," she said. The woman named Lovett set down her rolling pin. She didn't ask where she'd come from. She asked whether she could lift a full flour sack. She said she could. "Come back Thursday," Lovett said. "I'll know by Thursday." She came back Wednesday, not because she was impatient, but because she had nowhere else to be. And the alternative was sitting in the room she'd rented from the man at the edge of town. A man named Caulfield, who charged 3 days' rate for a week's use, and seemed to find this arrangement entirely reasonable. The room had one window that faced north, and a cot that was 3 inches too short, and she had slept in worse places but not recently. Lovett was rolling dough when she came in. She looked up without surprise. "I said Thursday." "I know. I came to ask if there's anything that needs doing before Thursday." Lovett looked at her for a long moment. Then she handed her a broom. The building had been a general store before Lovett had bought it and turned it into a bakery. And before that, from what she gathered, it had been a meeting house, a stable, and briefly, according to the oldest man in town, a man named Quorn, who sat outside the hardware store every afternoon and offered information without being asked. A courthouse for a trial that had ended with the defendant being acquitted and immediately leaving the territory. She swept. She swept the flour that had drifted into the corners and the mud someone had tracked in from the side door and the particular fine dust that settled in old buildings, no matter how often you cleared it. She found a broken latch on the back door and fixed it with a piece of wire she found in her coat pocket. She had kept a piece of wire in her coat pocket for 11 years, ever since the day she'd needed one and hadn't had it. Lovett watched her fix the latch without comment. "Come back Thursday," she said again, but differently this time. The work was not glamorous. It was not meant to be. She helped Lovett with the morning baking, carried deliveries to the 3 families who had standing orders, cleaned the equipment, and kept the account book in a hand that was clearer than Lovett's own. She did not offer to keep the account book. She did it one day when Lovett was short a hand and needed the column totaled, and she totaled it. And afterward Lovett said nothing except that the total was right. Trust between them grew the way ice forms on a pond, slowly, without announcement. And then one morning you look down and it is simply there. The town was called Sable Creek, though the creek itself had been dry for 6 years. Nobody had gotten around to renaming it. There were 31 permanent residents, a number that swelled to nearly 60 on Fridays when the ranchers came in from the surrounding land. She learned their names carefully and in order, the way she had learned things her whole life, not by being told, but by paying attention. There was a man who ran the hardware store, a quiet man named Deckett who sorted nails with a patience she found almost meditative to watch. There was the woman who operated the telegraph, a sharp-eyed woman they called Mrs. Price, who wore the same gray dress every day and seemed to regard all incoming messages with personal suspicion. There was the doctor, Halvard, who had come from somewhere in Ontario and who walked with a slight list to the left that she suspected he'd had so long he no longer noticed it. And there was the man who ran the mill. She noticed him first from a distance, which is the safest way to notice things. He was older than her, perhaps 15 years, perhaps more, with the kind of hands that come from decades of useful work and the kind of face that had stopped arranging itself to make other people comfortable. He did not smile easily. He was not unfriendly. There is a difference, and it took her most of the first month to locate it precisely. His name was Vane. She heard Lovett say it once, and then heard Quorn say it twice, and did not ask further. The mill had a problem with its secondary wheel. She knew this because she had walked past it 6 times in her first 2 weeks, and every time she could hear, beneath the main sound of the works, a smaller sound, irregular, slightly dragging. that did not belong there. It was the sound of something not quite right, which is a different sound from something wrong. Wrong things make a clean sound. Things not quite right make a sound like a question. She was not a millwright. She had never worked in a mill. But she had spent 3 years working with her uncle, who repaired farming equipment in a valley 2 provinces east, and she understood the principle of things that turn. She said nothing about the sound for 3 weeks. Then one afternoon she was returning from a delivery on the North Road when she passed the mill. At the moment the wheel stopped. Not because the river had stopped, because something had caught. She put down the empty delivery basket and went around to the wheel side. The problem was a timber brace, partly rotted at its base, which had shifted by perhaps 2 inches over the course of, she estimated, looking at the wear pattern around it, 6 to 8 months. It had shifted enough to throw the secondary wheel slightly off its line. Not enough to stop working, enough to drag. She looked at it for a while. She did not have the tools she needed. She had a small knife and the wire in her coat pocket, and 2 feet of twine she used to tie delivery parcels. None of that was sufficient. She went back and picked up the basket. The next morning she was at the mill door before it opened. Vane came out from inside when he heard her knock, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has not yet decided whether he is interested. "The brace on the secondary wheel," she said. "It needs to come out." He looked at her. She looked at him. Creak, dry as it was, made a sound like wind through grass. "I know," he said. He said it without defensiveness, which told her something. A man defensive about his mill would have said, "I've been meaning to get to that." He just said he knew. "Do you need another pair of hands?" she asked. He considered her the way Lovett had, those first days, not with skepticism exactly, but with the careful attention of someone who has learned that people are more or less than they appear in roughly equal measure. "Can you work from height?" "Yes." "It takes 3 days at minimum. The brace has to come out, the mount needs to be reset, and the wheel alignment has to be checked before it's worth running again." "I know," she said. He almost smiled then. She noticed because it almost happened and then didn't. "Come back after your morning work," he said. The mill was a cedar structure, river-fronted, with a loft that held 3 seasons' worth of sacking material and a smell she associated with childhood, dust and damp wood, and the particular cold that gathers in old buildings during the night and doesn't quite leave by morning. He showed her the brace. She had been right about the shift, nearly right about the timeline. He said 7 months, and exactly right about what needed to be done. She didn't say so. She picked up the smaller of the 2 pry bars he offered and positioned herself on the near side of the mount. They worked without speaking for most of the first morning. He was methodical. She matched his pace rather than setting her own, because she was in his space and it was courteous, and also because watching someone work tells you more about them than a week of conversation. What she learned, he did not skip steps. He did not hurry the parts that required patience. When something didn't go as expected, the base of the old brace had deteriorated further than either of them had thought, and the replacement timber needed to be cut down by several inches. He stopped, reassessed, and started again without visible frustration. She found this unusual. She found it restful. By midday, they had the old brace out. He went inside to cut the new timber. She stayed with the wheel and listened to the river, which was the creek fed by meltwater from the northern hills, and which was, at this time of year, a real river, even if the town refused to call it one. He came back with the cut timber, and they fitted it into the mount, and she held it in position while he worked the bolts. And she was aware of how much pressure the thing was under, and aware that she was aware of it, but not afraid. "Hold that line," he said. "I am holding it." "Both sides," she said. He looked at the mount. Both sides were in fact correct. "Yes," he said, "both sides." It took 4 days, he had said 3, but the alignment required 2 full adjustments before it settled, and he would not call it done until it was done. She respected this, even when her arms ached. On the 4th afternoon, the wheel ran, clean and even, with no secondary sound beneath the main working. He stood and listened to it for a long time. She stood beside him and listened to it too. Lovett had given her the afternoon without being asked, had in fact handed her a piece of bread wrapped in cloth when she left that morning and said only, "Don't be in a rush getting back." She had understood this to be a form of approval. It It's the best it's run in a year, he said. Longer, she said. The wear pattern on the mount. He looked at her. 11 months. She had been going to say 12. She let it go. He picked up the tools and carried them inside, and she followed with the ones she'd been using. He washed his hands at the basin near the door, and she washed hers after him, and then he did an unexpected thing. He put the kettle on. She sat in the chair he indicated, the less broken of the two, and waited while he made tea. And she thought about what it meant that he had made tea, and she decided it meant only that it was late afternoon, and he made tea in the late afternoon, and she happened to be there. It was good tea. Where did you come from? He asked, not demanding. The way you ask someone something when you're prepared for any answer. She told him, briefly. The valley 2 provinces east. Her uncle's equipment yard. The winter that had been too hard and the spring that had not been sufficient. The particular logic of moving when staying no longer makes sense. He nodded. He did not offer his own history in exchange, which she appreciated. Symmetry in conversation is often forced. You knew what you were looking at, he said. With the brace. I knew what I was hearing. He thought about this. I never heard it. You stopped listening, she said, and then caught herself. That wasn't no, he said. You're right. He said it without defensiveness, same as before. Sable Creek had, for most of its existence, organized itself around the fact that everyone had too much to do. There was no surplus of time or attention, which meant that people were evaluated quickly and on the basis of what they could do and whether they showed up. She had been there 6 weeks when she understood that she had passed some test she hadn't known she was taking. It expressed itself as small things. Quorn started directing his afternoon observations toward her when she passed, rather than at the general air. Deckett held the hardware store door an extra beat when he saw her coming with her hands full. Mrs. Price, who had regarded her initial weeks with the same suspicious attention she gave to incoming messages, asked her one morning whether she wanted the weekly wire summary posted to Lovett's, or whether she'd prefer to collect it herself. She said she'd collect it herself. Thought so, Mrs. Price said, which seemed to be high praise. She did not know what to make of her own feelings about this. She had moved a great many times. She had learned not to accumulate things, objects or attachments, because the math of moving didn't favor weight in either category. She was good at arriving and better at leaving. She had, as a practical matter, become someone who moved through places without leaving impressions, the way water moves through a hand. But she kept noticing things here. She noticed that the bread Lovett made on Thursdays was different from the bread she made on Mondays. Not better or worse, but shaped differently, with a particular scoring on the top that she had started making after the death of her daughter 8 years before. She noticed this because she noticed everything, and because Lovett had mentioned the daughter once and then never again, and the bread was there every Thursday like a small ceremony. She noticed that Deckett's youngest child, a boy of perhaps 7, round-faced and inclined to hover in the doorway of the hardware store without coming in, was afraid of something she couldn't identify. Not of noise, not of strangers, something more specific. She was still working on it. She noticed that the mill, since they'd fixed it, had started doing a slightly higher volume on Fridays, which meant that Vane was either taking on more grain or grinding it more often. And she didn't know which but suspected the latter. In October, the first serious cold came in from the north. She had known cold before. The valley she'd come from was no warmer. But this cold had a specific quality, a flatness to it that she hadn't encountered. It came without wind, which she found more unsettling than if it had come with a gale. Wind at least announces itself. This cold simply arrived, like a decision that had been made elsewhere and was now being implemented. She was repairing a section of the bakery's exterior siding. Lovett had mentioned it twice in passing, which was Lovett's way of mentioning things she wanted done. When the sky changed color in the north, it did not go gray. It went the particular shade of pale yellow-white that she had never seen before but understood immediately. She came down the ladder and went inside. "There's weather coming," she said to Lovett. Lovett looked out the window. "How long? 6 hours, maybe less." Lovett looked at her. "I'll send Keelan to the Munro house." Keelan was the boy who helped with deliveries, 13 years old and reliable in the way of children who have learned early that reliability is the only power they have. He was gone before she had finished relatching the tool cupboard. She thought about the mill. She thought about it for approximately 3 minutes, which was as long as she was willing to spend on indecision, and then she put on her coat. The mill was a quarter-mile up the creek road. She walked it in the wrong direction from the warmth into the increasing cold, thinking about what she knew and what she didn't know. She knew the wheel. She did not know the structure well enough to know where it was vulnerable to this particular kind of cold. Vane was in the yard when she arrived, looking at the same sky she'd been looking at. "I don't know this kind," she said, by way of greeting. "No," he said. "You wouldn't. It doesn't come often." He paused, the south corner of the upper loft. She looked at the building. Moisture in the beams, every autumn. The beams pull away from the joint when they freeze. "I reinforce it every year, and every year it's not quite enough. Show me," he showed her. The problem, in the south corner of the upper loft, was a joint that had been improperly set. She suspected it had been improperly set for 30 years, predating Vane's ownership, and which expanded and contracted with seasonal moisture until the stress became, in extreme cold, a real risk to the upper structure. They worked through the remaining daylight and into the first hour of dark, wedging the joint, resetting the load transfer, and packing insulation material around the base of the most vulnerable beam. She did not have the tools for a permanent fix. She had enough for a good one. The cold deepened as they worked. Her hands went from cold to numb, and then to a kind of functional distance from sensation that she recognized and worked within. "That's enough," he said at some point. She looked at what they'd done. Yes. He looked at her hands. She had not mentioned the cold. "Come inside," he said. She stayed until the storm broke. This was, she would later think, the moment. Not the tea, not the mill repair, not the weeks of small recognitions. The moment was this, sitting in the mill house kitchen while snow came down in absolute silence outside, and realizing she was not calculating the cost of staying versus going. She was just sitting there. She was just drinking tea. She was not, for the first time in a very long time, preparing to leave. She did not say any of this aloud. She was still sitting there when Vane came back in from checking the yard, snow on his shoulders, and poured the remaining tea, which was cold by then, and drank it without comment. He did not seem to find it strange that she was there. She did not seem to find it strange either. Outside, the storm did a particular thing that storms in that country apparently do. It paused, briefly, in the middle of its business, and in the pause the sky cleared and the stars came out, brighter than she had ever seen them, and then the snow resumed. She saw the stars through the small north window. She did not say anything about them, she thought. "I have been here before, in the middle of something, looking at something brief and clear, and I have always waited for it to end so I could keep moving," she thought. "I am not sure I want to keep moving." She did not pursue the thought. She set down her cup and said she should check on Lovett's bakery, and he said the road would be passable by first light. And she said she knew, and she left. In November, she fixed the latch on Deckett's storage room door, which had been misaligned since spring. She fixed it on a Tuesday afternoon, when she had an hour between Lovett's midday work and the late delivery run, and she did not mention it to anyone except Deckett, who looked at the latch for a long moment, and then said, "I've been meaning to get to that," which she understood as his version of thank you. She helped Mrs. Price reroute the telegraph line that had been throwing interference since late summer, not because she knew telegraphy, but because she understood the principle of interrupted signals. And the interruption turned out to be mechanical rather than electrical. A bracket at the second pole had corroded through, and the wire was touching the pole itself. She fixed the bracket. She did not charge anything for it. She taught the boy Keelan to calculate delivery times accounting for weather and road conditions, because he had been calculating them incorrectly, and this was causing small frictions with the families who had standing orders. He learned quickly. She told him he was quicker than she'd been at his age, which was true. She was not accumulating things. She told herself this. She was just doing what was in front of her to do. In December, a letter came. It was addressed to her by name, which meant someone knew where she was, which meant her sister had managed to find her, which was something her sister did with a regularity that she found simultaneously irritating and quietly reassuring. Her sister had 7 children and a husband meant whom went well, and a house in the valley 2 provinces east, and she wrote letters the way some people talk, continuously and about everything, leaving no gap for the other person to respond before the next wave arrived. She read the letter twice. Her sister wanted her to come home for Christmas. She used the word home without examining it, which was something her sister did often. She said the children missed her. She said their mother had had a difficult autumn. She said, "You can't spend your life running toward whatever next place you think will be different." She folded the letter carefully and put it in the inner pocket of her coat. She thought about the word running. She did not think she had been running. She thought the more accurate word was moving, and that there was a difference. Running implies something behind you. Moving implies something ahead. She was not sure, anymore, which one she had been doing. She wrote back the following week. She wrote, "I am well. Tell mother the cold here is different from what we knew. Tell her it is better in some ways. Tell the children I will send something for Christmas. I cannot say when I will be back." She read this over. She crossed out "cannot say when" and wrote "do not know if." She crossed that out too. She wrote, "I am well. Tell mother I have found a place that uses me correctly." She did not know if this was the right thing to say. She sent it anyway. In the new year, when the cold had softened slightly and the creek had developed the thin ice at its edges that meant spring was somewhere in the future, if not the present, Vane came into the bakery on a morning when Lovett was out and she was managing the front counter. He bought bread, which he did every Thursday. He set the coins on the counter, and then, instead of leaving, he said, "Quorn tells me you've been looking at the Henderson building." The Henderson building was the empty structure on the east end of the main road, a former dry goods store that had been closed since its owner had died the previous winter, leaving no family and no will, and an unclear arrangement with the town council. She had looked at it twice from the outside and once, when the door had been left unlocked following a council inspection, from the inside. "I walked through it once," she said. "Quorn sees everything. I know." He looked at the bread he'd bought as if he were thinking about something other than bread. "It has a structural issue in the back wall," he said. "Northeast corner." "I know," she said. "It's repairable." He looked up at her. "Lovett has been asking the council about it for 2 years," she added. "For a storage building." "I know she has." He paused. "The council is more likely to move on it if someone with relevant experience speaks to the repair costs." She understood what he was saying. "I'll look at it properly," she said. "I'll need access in some time." "I'll speak to Abershaw," he said. Abershaw was the council chair, a slow-moving and not unkind man who trusted measurements over opinions. "He'll give you the time." He took his bread and left. She watched him cross the street, the way he walked, that particular quality of purposefulness without hurry. And she thought about what it meant that he had come in and said this, and she decided it could mean several things, and she would need more information before she could determine which. But she felt something that she hadn't felt in a long time, which was the specific warmth that comes from being seen clearly and treated accordingly. Not as a woman, not as a stranger, not as someone useful to a task, as a person whose judgment could be relied on. She went back to the bread. Spring came in stages, as it apparently always did in that part of the country. A week of warmth, a week of cold, another week of warmth, as if the season was testing the arrangement before committing to it. The creek ran properly by April, loud and cold, and the particular color of glacial water, which is not blue but not gray either, and for which she had no word. She assessed the Henderson building over the course of 2 weeks. She produced a written report with 3 cost estimates, low, median, and conservative, and delivered it to Abershaw, who read it with the careful attention he gave to measurements, and asked her 2 questions and seemed satisfied with both answers. The council voted in favor of the repair in May. Lovett said nothing when she heard, except that she made the Thursday bread that week with a different scoring on the top, a pattern she had not used before, something like the outline of a building, or perhaps just lines that crossed each other at angles, and she made it only that once and then never again. She told no one else until Quorn appeared at the bakery counter the following Tuesday and said, "Heard about the Henderson building, did you?" she said. "Abershaws don't make decisions they haven't already made," he said sagely. which she understood to mean that the outcome had not been in doubt, which she doubted, but which she found comforting in its way. Deckett stopped by with a box of tools he said he had been meaning to lend someone for some time. There was no one else he could have meant. She started work in June. The repair took most of the summer. She hired 2 local men for the heavier structural work. Brothers named Quelch, who worked without conversation and with a comfortable efficiency that she found restful. And she managed the materials, the timeline, and the decisions about what to restore and what to replace. There was a moment, toward the end of July, when she was working alone in the building in the late afternoon, and she stopped, for no particular reason, and looked at the northeast corner. The wall was solid. The timber was new. She had insisted on it, despite the added cost, because the alternative was repairing something that would need repairing again in 8 years, and she could not see the point. The joint was set correctly. The structure would stand for another 50 years. She stood there and looked at it. Then she did something she had not planned to do. She found a nail in her coat pocket. She kept a nail there along with the wire, a habit she had developed somewhere along the way, and she pressed it against the new timber in the corner, at roughly shoulder height, and made a small mark. Just a line, not a signature, not a symbol. Just a line to show that the measurement was correct, the corner was true, the work was done. She looked at the mark for a moment, then she put the nail back in her coat pocket and went back to work. The building was finished in August. Lovett moved her winter stores in during the first week. The Quelch brothers came back to build the interior shelving, and she showed them the measurements, and they didn't ask questions. And the shelving was straight. On the last day of the work, when the last thing had been done and the tools had been cleaned and returned, and there was nothing left that required her to be there, she stood at the door of the building for a long time. She had not packed the bag she kept under her cot at Caulfield's. She had thought about it, had in fact gone so far as to pull it out once in mid-July and look at its contents. The things that constituted everything she carried, which were fewer than most people would expect and more than she liked. She had looked at the bag and put it back. She was still in the room at Caulfield's. It still had the cot that was 3 inches too short. The north-facing window showed her a view of the creek road and, on clear days, the upper edge of the mill. She watched the mill sometimes from that window. She was watching it now, from across the road, from the door of the building she had repaired. And she thought about all the things she had looked at in her life, and all the places she had moved through, and what it meant that this was the thing she kept looking at. Vane came across the road at some point in the late afternoon. She didn't hear him until he was close, which was unusual. She was normally the first to hear things. She attributed this to the state she was in, which was a state she did not have a precise word for. He stood beside her and looked at the building. "The corner," he said. "Yes, it's better than it was." "It's correct," she said. "It was never correct." He nodded. He looked at the building and she looked at it too, and there was no sound except the creek, which was lower now in the late summer and moved with a slower quality than it had in spring. "There's a roof on the Schooler barn," he said after a while. 2 miles east. They've been patching it for 3 years." She said nothing. "Schooler's good for materials if someone will put in the time," he said. She looked at the mill, which she could see at the end of the road, its wheel turning in the light. "I've never roofed a barn," she said. "I know. It's different from siding, different from structural work. Yes, I'd need to look at it first." "I know that," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the building, not at her, with the same expression he'd used on the mill wheel when they had finally gotten it running right. Not satisfaction exactly, but something quieter and more specific than satisfaction. The expression of a person who looks at something and finds it correct. "I'll look at it," she said. He nodded once. Then he went back across the road to the mill. She stood at the door of the Henderson building for another few minutes. The sun was moving. The creek was running. The wheel was turning with a particular clean sound that meant every part of it was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. She had not packed the bag. She was not going to pack the bag. She walked back toward the bakery because Lovett would want the side door locked before evening. And she was the one with the key now. And there was still the bread to account for. And the Thursday order needed checking. And there was a latch on the storage room door that she had noticed. last week, had started to work loose again. She would get to it in the morning.